Row. I hope you're having an awesome week and an even awesomer day. So for today's art project, what I'm going to show you is marker painting. And what's really cool about this is that you only need markers and water. Basically that's it, and a brush. And it kind of creates this really cool watercolor effect, which is very, very nice. And the great part is that once you get the hang of it, you can do so many different types of cool designs with it. This is kind of like my imaginary castle that I decided to do, so I'll show you how to do this design if you like it. But again, once you get the hang of the process, then you can kind of do whatever you want with it. Also, I would like to say that if you have submitted things, either through the Google form or through sending me an email, thank you so much. I have gotten them. I've gotten so many emails recently, it's been a little bit hard to respond to all of them, but I want you to know that I have them. I'm saving all the pictures for the virtual art celebration, and if I have any questions about any of your work, I'll send you an email and let you know. But again, I apologize for not being able to reply to every single email that I've been getting, but the work has been so good. I'm so proud of you guys for sending them to me, and again, just keep them coming. Even if it's not for the art celebration video, I would just love to see them anyway. So, okay, moving on to the video.
Okay, so for the materials that you're going to need, you will want a piece of paper, preferably one that is thicker. If you have cardstock or mixed media paper, that would be the best. I cut mine down to, I think, 5.5 by 7.5. You also want some markers. This is a new pack that I got, pretty excited, and they need to be washable markers. But again, like any Crayola markers work as well. You are also going to want some water in a little glass, and you are also going to want a brush to go along with that water, of course. Then you're going to want to get out a pencil and an eraser, and then also a Sharpie. And again, not a black marker, but a Sharpie. It needs to be a permanent marker that is not water soluble. And then also a paper towel to clean up some of your mess. So for my example, I'm basically going to be recreating a similar version to my imaginary castle piece that I showed you in the beginning of the video. So what I like to do is to just draw in my drawing first with my pencil instead of the Sharpie, just because I like to make sure that I am happy with how it looks first. But it's up to you. If you want to go straight for the Sharpie, you can. So what I decided to start with for the imaginary castle was basically some of the little tower buildings. So basically the tower buildings are just kind of a lot of straight lines. You can have some pointy tops if you want. You can even do some sort of castle-y looking lines like the ones I'm creating right now, where they're kind of like zigzag but they're more square. You can also maybe have a few pieces that are kind of jutting out. You could even create like some arrows that sometimes helps it look like a tower at the top. But honestly, you can just pretty much make up however you want it to look, or if you want to copy what I'm doing, that's also fine. It's up to you. I basically just thought that it would be nice to have a few tall towers mixed with a few shorter kind of buildings. But since this is an imaginary castle, it's really up to you, so there's not really a wrong way to do it as long as you're happy with it. I just think that personally it looks nice having a few tall areas with a few shorter areas, and then having some of them have pointier tops and some of them not have pointier tops. I also added a few balls at the top of some of the towers just for an extra fun aspect. And when I was done with the castle, I made it basically sink back down to the very bottom of the page. Here you can see I'm erasing some areas and just making some of the towers look a little bit better, like the way I want them to. So after this point, if you are pretty happy with it, you can go ahead and start creating like windows or gates. I created some of these little arch windows. You can always do the shapes that are like this, where it's kind of like a half oval, or you could even do just rectangles or squares. It's whatever you like, and it's whatever you're comfortable with drawing. I'm going to kind of use the half ovals, which are kind of like arches for these areas, just because I kind of just like how they look. So I'm going in and I'm adding one really big one towards the bottom, which is kind of like the entrance, I like to think, to my imaginary castle. And then I'm adding several tinier ones in some of my buildings, which I like to think of as windows. Of course, there's not really a rhyme or reason to this part. It's really just putting them where you think it'd be kind of fun to have them. You can have as many or as few as you want. So yeah, just go ahead and have fun with it. After I was done with all the windows, I decided to draw a little hill behind the castle, sort of showing that it's on the ground. But you could always pretend that it's a floating castle and not add this extra line that I did, but it's up to you. The next thing that I did is I added a sun, but since in my example I did a sun, I decided that I would do a moon in this one. I was thinking that since my example looked like it was sort of during the day, that I could make this version that I'm doing right now kind of look like an imaginary castle at night. But it's basically going to be the same drawing, just instead of a sun, it's a moon. Then I went ahead and added just some clouds, kind of like some fluffy little sheep clouds. And I added several. I think it looks kind of nice when you have some of your clouds behind your castle, sort of like they're overlapping. I just think it adds a little extra something that makes it look a bit more interesting. Of course, there's not an exact amount of clouds that you need to put. I just decided to have several at the top, and you can even have some of your clouds going off of the page if you want. And it's kind of nice to have a few tiny clouds, a few big clouds. But again, like I said earlier, it's up to you. It's whatever you like. Although one idea too is that if you wanted to make it like a floating castle, you could just put clouds everywhere in the background and not have that little hill behind it. So that's also kind of a fun idea. You could even put clouds at the bottom if you wanted to. That's something I thought of just now, but hey, why not try it out? So once that's all done, you can go ahead and grab your Sharpie. Again, like I said, not a black marker. It needs to be a permanent marker. So this part's pretty straightforward. You want to just go ahead and go over every single line that you've drawn and just take your time, be careful. Once you've traced over all your lines, the next thing that you could think about is how you want to fill in the windows. Basically, in my example, I filled them all in with Sharpie, but you could always fill it in with like colored pencil if you want. I would suggest not filling in such tiny areas with marker, only because it might bleed a little bit later. But like I mentioned earlier, I want to make this imaginary castle look like it's at night, so it just made sense for me to fill them in black. But I mean, I could have gone in and taken a yellow color pencil and filled that in as well. Also, any really tiny areas like the balls at the top of my buildings, I'm also going to color in with Sharpie later on as well. After you filled everything in, just make sure that you go back and erase any extra pencil lines that you can see, just to make it neat. So the next part is that you will want to pick out a few colors that you want to use for your marker painting. So I basically decided that maybe using 5 colors would be a good idea just because of how I set it up. Once you have your colors picked out, go ahead and take your first color and you want to outline along the lines of whichever area you want to color in with that marker. So I'm using yellow for the moon, so as you can see, I'm just outlining, again, not filling in completely, just outlining the outer parts of that moon. So to see a little bit more up close, again, I did not fill in all the different areas, I only outlined the inner part. So for the clouds, for example, I am just doing the exact same thing. I am outlining all the extra lines. And again, the cloud is behind the moon, so I even added an extra line on that part. And since the cloud was going off the page, I added an extra line on the very side. Outlining the inner part of the area that you want colored is essentially the whole process, just for the marker part. And so the reason why you're doing that is that basically, again, each marker has a certain amount of ink or color in it, right? So you're outlining the area that you want, you're providing ink with that marker, and then once we go over it with water, we're going to be able to spread some of that ink or that color around, and that's what's going to kind of give it that really cool watercolor effect. So you want to make sure that you're adding a little bit more marker than less marker, because you want to make sure that you have enough color to spread around once we get to the water part with the brush. One important thing to note is that if you are working with any really small areas, like the area in the tower that I'm working on right now, then I would probably suggest to just kind of fill all of it in, just because it makes your life a little bit easier. I mean, since I would have to outline around that little arch window and I'd have to outline the insides of the tower, it just made sense to fill that in. So keep that in mind. Another really important thing to know is that for smaller areas, like the moon or the clouds or the little like valley behind my castle in my example, you can outline it once and that should provide enough color or enough ink once we add water. But for a really large area like this castle, you're going to want to make your outline and your marker a lot thicker because you want to add more ink. Because it's just a bigger area, so it needs more color. So as you can see, I'm kind of outlining it a lot thicker around all the different areas in my castle. And remember that you want to also go around the areas where the windows or the arches are, as well as, again, the bottom or the sides of the paper too. Something else I didn't really mention earlier about colors is just thinking about which ones would look the best together. So I chose a few colors that were on the darker side because, again, I wanted my imaginary castle to look like it was happening at night. So that's why I made the sky a bit purple, kind of like to show that it's just darker outside. And also that's why the clouds and the castle are also kind of in similar colors with that bluish turquoise color. So now, once you've got everything outlined and you feel like you've got enough ink on there, go ahead and get your water, your paper towel, and your brush. So you're going to want to dip your brush in the water and then wipe off some of that excess onto the side of your cup that you're using. Because one thing that you want to make sure you don't do is you don't want to add too much water, or else it could kind of make just everything blur together, which personally I would suggest not trying. So once you add the water to your area, you basically just want to kind of swirl your brush over the markered areas because, again, you're kind of using that marker that you applied like sort of like ink. So you're kind of trying to spread it around. So as you can see, I'm kind of dabbing around that area. One really important thing to note is that you don't want to go past that Sharpie line that's separating that area, because the minute that your brush goes into another area where another color is, it's going to start mixing in with that color. So that's why I like using a pointier brush, because it kind of helps me get in those tiny areas a little bit better. But again, obviously use what you have. I remember, just be careful. And the great thing about the Sharpie, which is one of the reasons why I had you use Sharpie, is because it's a permanent marker. So even if your brush goes over the Sharpie with water, nothing's going to happen to the Sharpie. So the Sharpie is like the dividing line between all of your different colored areas. This is just my suggestion for when you're working, but once you start working on an area with one color, then I would suggest just finishing up that area with all of those colors. So like I did the valley, that little green area, that hill down there, so I just decided to fill in both parts of the hill at one time since my brush already had that color on it. And then I decided to move on to the moon, and then once I was in with that, I made sure that I really wetted my brush and wiped my brush off to make sure that it was clean for the next color. So one thing to keep in mind is that like I said earlier, you don't want any of your colors to bleed together. So it's usually a pretty smart idea to basically work on one area, and while it's drying, move to an area that's farther away from it. So for example, I colored in the moon, and then while it's drying, I decided to start doing the clouds, but I started working on the clouds from the very opposite side of the paper, so that would give the moon a little bit of time to dry before I got over to that area. Another suggestion to make sure that things don't start blending together, if you want to be extra careful, is to basically just kind of give a little bit of drying time in between really big areas. So since the clouds were close to the sky and the castle, I decided to give it a little bit of time before I started working on the castle. When you're working on very large areas like the castle, again, it's if you need to, you can always go back with your brush that's, again, just a little wet, and touch some of the areas that have a lot more marker on them and kind of drag that color around if you need to. Remember to use just a little bit of water because, again, like I said earlier, you can always add a little bit more water, but it's a lot harder to take that water away. And the more water that you add, the more warped your paper might start to get too as well. So another good reason to use less water. So I let my castle dry for a little bit, and so now I'm going to go ahead and start working on the sky, which is my last area. So again, I'm just dragging around some of that ink, some of that color, and trying to spread it out as much as possible. If you ever feel like you don't have enough ink in one area, you can always go ahead and take your brush, touch some of the marker from another area that had more ink, and then just bring it over to the area where you want more ink as a side note. And once you're done, there you have it, your very cool marker painting, which again looks a little bit like watercolor, which is a pretty fun addition. So one thing to keep in mind is that you want to go ahead and make sure that this dries as flat as possible. Depending on the paper you're using, it might even warp a little bit. So once it's completely dry, you can always just kind of put it under a big book to help flatten it out some. But again, I would love to see what you guys come up with. Please send me pictures, and I will see you next week. Bye.